Healthy interdependent relationships mean I can become a master of my own needs and self-soothing and feeling good in the relationship to myself and spending time alone. And I can become a master at feeling safe to rely on other people and to communicate my needs to others as well.
Welcome to The One You Feed. Throughout time, great thinkers have recognized the importance of the thoughts we have. Quotes like garbage in, garbage out, or you are what you think ring true. And yet, for many of us, our thoughts don't strengthen or empower us. We tend toward negativity, self-pity, jealousy, or fear. We see what we don't have instead of what we do. We think things that hold us back and dampen our spirit. But it's not just about thinking. Our actions matter. It takes conscious, consistent, and creative effort to make a life worth living. This podcast is about how other people keep themselves moving in the right direction, how they feed their good wolf. Thanks for joining us. Our guest on this episode is Thais Gibson, a relationship expert that has been recognized by Bloomberg News, Psychology Today, and various other outlets for her revolutionary work in integrated attachment theory. Thais has worked with thousands of clients and helped them to positively transform their lives, relationships, and goals. She has over 30 million views across her social platforms and is certified in 13 different areas of therapy. Today, Thais and Eric discuss her book, Learning Love, Build the Best Relationships of Your Life Using Integrated Attachment Theory.
Hi, Thais. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Eric. Excited to be here with you.
Yeah, we're going to be discussing your book, Learning Love, Build the Best Relationships of Your Life Using Integrated Attachment Theory. And we'll also be talking about your version of that, which is called Gibson Integrated Attachment Theory. But before we get into all that, we'll start like we always do with a parable. In the parable, there's a grandparent who's talking with their grandchild, and they say, in life, there are two wolves inside of us that are always at battle. One is a good wolf, which represents things like kindness and bravery and love. And the other is a bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. And the grandchild stops, and they think about it for a second. They look up at their grandparent and they say, well, which one wins? And the grandparent says, the one you feed. So I'd like to start off by asking you what that parable means to you in your life and in the work that you do.
So I love this. So to me, honestly, a lot of, and I was telling you before we started recording that I've heard this parable and it was really influential in my own journey over a decade ago. And to me, it actually represents the ego mind. And I think the ego mind is something that, research from the University of Southern California's Neuroimaging Institute says we think 60 to 70,000 thoughts per day. And roughly 50,000 of them are repeated from the day before. And something that was so powerful in my own journey was to watch my thoughts and to recognize when I was thinking really negative thoughts about myself, putting myself down, beating myself up, really lacking self-compassion. And I really made a big effort on my own journey of healing to feed the wolf that was more about self-compassion, gentleness, not constantly trying to punish myself into being better or growing more. And when I actually made more of an effort in my internal dialogue to be kind, that was super influential for me. And so I think of it as like the thinking level, the ego mind level, and how we operate from that perspective.
Listener, as you're listening, what resonated with you in that? I think a lot of us have some ideas of things that we can do to feed our good wolf, and here's a good tip to make it more likely that you do it. It can be really helpful to reflect right before you do that thing on why you want to do it. Our brains are always making a calculation of what neuroscientists would call reward value. Basically, is this thing worth doing? And so when you're getting ready to do this thing that you want to do to feed your good wolf, reflecting on why actually helps to make the reward value on that higher and makes it more likely that you're going to do that. For example, if what you're trying to do is exercise, right before you're getting ready to exercise, it can be useful to remind yourself of why. For example, I want to exercise because it makes my mental and emotional health better today. If you'd like a step-by-step guide for how you can easily build new habits that feed your good wolf, go to goodwolf.me/change and join the free masterclass. I love that. That's great. sort of plunges us right into a core part of a lot of your work, which is talking about the subconscious. So, because different people have different definitions and theories, and I'm going to ask you for yours in a second. But we know, as you said, that a huge amount of what we think is habitual, repeated, meaning it's arising from somewhere, right? And where it's arising from is what we might call the subconscious. I mean, all you have to do is sit down and meditate for a couple minutes to realize, and it may be one of the best insights for meditation is, oh, wait a second. I, as I think of myself, am not generating these thoughts. They're just coming. So what does the subconscious mean to you?
The subconscious mind is what is currently out of our awareness. It's really our programmed, habituated self. Now, people will often hear, our conscious mind is our logical thinking self, more associated, for example, with like the neocortex or prefrontal cortex regions, if we had to make that sort of analogy or link. And the subconscious mind is all of these programs that we have. So, for example, if we grew up in a household where we were constantly criticized, then you might start criticizing yourself all the time in your own internal dialogue, because we take in that set of programs, and whatever we're exposed to through repetition and emotion is what really programs or patterns in the subconscious mind. Now, you'll often hear people use the words subconscious and unconscious interchangeably, but there actually is an important difference, and it's that your subconscious mind, you can quite easily retrieve information from. So you can look back and be like, oh yeah, when I was a kid, I did feel not good enough. Or, oh yeah, 3 days ago, I did feel emotionally a little bit upset about something. So it may not be in your conscious mind's awareness, but you can pull up and retrieve. Whereas your unconscious mind is much more difficult to actually retrieve information from. And it's why I spend a lot of time focusing on the subconscious, because we can gain a lot of insight from there.
I had a therapist who referred to that as the pre-conscious. The subconscious is in the way he would call pre-conscious, what you're sort of calling subconscious, meaning
yes,
it's available for retrieval. So let me ask you a question. So we're going to talk about attachment theory, and attachment theory is basically postulating that we relate to other people based on a lot of what happened to us when we were really young, right? Whatever patterns were happened there, they influence us in our relationships today. And you say that a lot of our attachment style is formed before we're the age of 2, right? So that stuff is unconscious, right? Because I don't have any idea what happened to me before 2. So say more about how that aligns.
Yes. So the original work of studying attachment styles was done by John Bowlby and later Mary Ainsworth, and that's something we've built upon now. But basically, there was an experiment called the strange situation experiment. And this is how they could actually observe children's attachment styles at such a young age. And so what they would see is they would leave a young child with a parent in sort of what looked like a doctor's office waiting room. And they would have the parent exit the room just briefly and then return to the room. And they could study and see, based on the child's responses and behaviors, what attachment type each individual was. So the anxious attachment style, which is sort of the more needy or clingy attachment style, would really panic when the parent left the room. And they would have a stranger come into the room at the same time and just sit there for a moment and then have the parent return. And the anxious attachment style would be very clingy when the parent returned, and you could observe those patterns of behavior. Mm-hmm. The dismissive avoidant attachment style, when the parent returned, you could see they would actually try to minimize their own attachment needs. So they would see the parent and they would look away. And they wouldn't really make eye contact or posture in their body language towards trying to connect or attach. And then the fearful avoidant or disorganized attachment style would be very hot and cold, back and forth, would kind of crawl towards the parent, move away, or if the parent would get too close, they would look away, but then they would kind of go back, and they were really all over the map in their behavior. And so you could see the original attachment style at that space. Now, what's really interesting is because of neuroplasticity, our attachment style can shift and change over time. So for example, you could have somebody who grows up in a securely attached home, but then see their parents go through a painful divorce, for example, at the age of 8. And because the subconscious subconscious gets programmed through repetition and emotion, then what ends up happening is somebody could suddenly become anxiously attached, for example. So yes, our earliest set of attachment patterns and learnings does form at an unconscious age, or an age where it's really the unconscious mind being programmed. But in order to retrieve information to see what patterns we are still carrying up into our adult lives, we can refer to patterns of different core wounds that we have or fears we have about relationships, which are our subconscious. We can refer to different dynamics in regards to unmet needs that we have, or emotional patterns we have, or ways that we communicate or set boundaries. And all of those things, we don't have to be able to go back into 1.5 years old, for example, to actually see what our attachment style is and our patterns are. We can actually observe that happening in our daily lives as adults.
Yeah. I think something you're saying there is really important, and I want to call it out, which is this idea of programming happens by repetition and emotion. And recognizing that programming is ongoing, right? We are, it's not just what happened to us, in ages of 2 to 5 or before the age of 2. There's a lot of talk about that, right? And while it can be helpful to know some of your patterns, it's also, I don't think, helpful to think of yourself as being anxiously attached as a identity. Right? In the same way
Absolutely.
you and I were talking before the show, right? There are ways in which for me to think of myself as an addict is a useful identity, and there are ways that becomes a hugely limiting identity. And I think things like attachment style or the things that happen to us as a child fall into that same category. They are useful to a point, but we also have to believe that can change.
100%. So the way I really teach about this through our programs, for example, is first of all, your attachment style is just your subconscious set of rules for love. It's not this like personality disorder or this huge clinical diagnosis. And it's just a set of conditioned patterns and ideas about what relationships are supposed to look like. So not only is it not static, it's not like we have this for life. We actually, when we understand our rules, we've broken attachment styles into 5 major categories of what's necessary to change to become securely attached. And I like to think of it as not a label for who you are or your identity, but a way to gain insight, almost like a window into your own patterns so that you can observe what's not working for you. And you can do the work very easily to recondition these patterns by actually leveraging principles of neuroplasticity to change and to become secure. So I definitely couldn't agree more with you that it's not this identity. It's not this diagnosis. It's actually just a way to gain insight into your patterns and see what you need to change.
Yeah, and I love that word pattern. I often use the word tendency when I'm talking about things like this. We have a tendency to be a certain way, but that's what it is, or we have a pattern of being a certain way. And I find that sort of a good middle road between not addressing or believing in the fact that our earlier experiences shape us, because of course they do, and also not being in a place where we feel like our earlier experiences are destiny, because they're not. And so what we're trying for is that, the middle ground. And I really like that word pattern as a way of describing it. We have patterns, but patterns can be broken. I mean, there's this core Buddhist concept that we're all conditioned, right, by life. And it's true. Like, we're just constantly being conditioned. And what can be conditioned can be unconditioned.
Yes. It's so funny. I say this all the time. This is like one of my catchphrases that I say is I'm like, you're not born with an attachment style. It gets conditioned into you through repetition and emotion. And just by leveraging the understanding of how conditioning works, you can recondition your patterns. And I'm sure you and I probably both agree from having similar backstories in different ways that like it can be so limiting to think you are going to struggle with something for your whole entire life. And I just don't see that as being the way. I think that unfortunately in some cases we have like a Western medical system, which I think serves tremendously in very specific cases, but we sort of have this system of our world and culture in many ways. It's like, oh, when you are a certain way, you're going to stay that way. You are your past is your destiny for your future. And I just so strongly disagree with that concept.
Yep. And I also think there are ways in which these ideas can be overused. Now, I'll give you an example. There was a time where a relationship, a really good relationship that I was in of about a decade, ended very suddenly and unexpectedly, and in a way I didn't want to have happen. And so the therapist I was seeing was talking about core wounds the whole time. And while I agree there is such a thing, and I do have some, at one point I said, let me ask you a question. What if I'd walked in here and told you that my partner had died? Because that's what we're talking about, right? The sudden end of a relationship that was really important. I don't think you would start talking to me about my core wounds, right? You probably would be talking to me about grief and the process of grief. And so my point there being like, and it's, I think it goes along with what you're saying, which is these are ways of thinking that can be really helpful. But like any lens, we want to be able to shift the lens around in a flexible way so that we don't start to see the world through only one way of seeing it.
Yes. So can I share a story with you though? Because I think
Please.
there's a nuance there that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So one of the first times, so I have a background in like CBT, hypnosis, all these things. I tried to figure out how we can take core wounds from a CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy perspective, and actually rewire them. It's a big part of the work that I do. And the first time I actually saw this so impactful from an external point of view, because I did a lot of this work internally, I was in practice for about a year, and I had two women that I was seeing. They were both new. So it was both their first day coming into session, and both were coming to me because they were fresh out of a divorce. And they were about the same age, and they both had two children also about the same age. And they had both been married for a similar period of time. And I was reading their intake forms in the morning. And I saw one before lunch and one after lunch. The first woman came in and she said, this is going to be hard. I need some support going through this divorce. I want support on how I can really help my children and assist them and make sure that they're okay. But I also know that this is for the best because our marriage really wasn't working. So we worked a lot on like her unmet needs that were going to happen, the process of grief in a healthy way, these sorts of things. She was stressed and upset coming into the session, but not anything, out of the ordinary. I had lunch, I saw the next woman, and of course, having just been through this past session, sort of expected it to be quite similar to the previous woman before. This woman came in and she had like stains all over her clothes. She was like completely disheveled. She was crying before she sat down on the couch. And she was like 10 out of 10 distressed. And I asked her, I said, well, what are you making this situation mean? And she said, I was never loved. Otherwise, he wouldn't have wanted to leave me. I'm going to be alone forever. I'm not good enough. I've always known I was unlovable. And I feel like I just don't matter to anyone. Now, all of those things are core wounds. And what happens is core wounds, when we have them from pre-existing ideas we've acquired about ourselves through conditioning, through past experiences and how they imprint the subconscious mind, core wounds magnify grief. So whenever we have grief is also unmet needs. Grief is also a process of emotions and nervous system regulation and things we have to be present with ourselves for. But grief goes from pain of unmet needs to the suffering of our stories, the moment we give meaning to the situation based on past experiences. Because what a core wound really is it's a subconscious idea we have about ourselves with all this pre-existing emotional storage. Because your subconscious mind retains everything. It consolidates memories over time. But we basically experience the pain of the objective situation in front of us combined with all the times we felt not good enough, unlovable, alone, these sorts of things in the past. And so core wounds are actually a really important part of processing grief, but we have to be able to also work on the needs, the emotional regulation, the nervous system work, the other parts of grief that are natural and going to be there. But it can be very useful and very supportive to strip those things back and actually work to recondition those ideas we have.
That's a really nice way of saying it, which is that the core wounds can amplify grief, right? And I think that's a really valid point, right? Because the core wounds, and we could translate that, if you don't love that phrase, core wounds, we could use the phrase core beliefs, right? Which, right? Our core beliefs, like you said, are how we make meaning out of things that happen. And the meaning we make out of what happens is a huge part of how we respond to that thing.
Exactly. I always give people the analogy because it's important to remember that when we go through difficult experiences, our mind is also wired to hang on to negative things more than positive. And the analogy I give to describe this is like if you're, walking in the forest tomorrow and you see a bear and you run away from the bear and you're safe and it's all okay, but you have to walk that same exact route the following day. You're not going to be like, oh, I remember that beautiful flower that was next to the bear yesterday. You're going to be like, I remember the bear and its teeth. And so what happens is when we have painful experiences throughout our lives that we can't properly process or make sense of, we store it with a lot of negative emotion because on a biological level, we've been wired over time and generations to go, well, if I hold on to the negative, I can project it into the future and I can stop these things from happening to me. I can protect myself from them like the bear. But unfortunately, it doesn't really work that way any longer because we're not in these ongoing survival situations on a daily basis in most of the Western world, at least.
Right.
And so what ends up happening is we just project all of these painful ideas about ourselves. And the most obvious ones people can probably relate to from this core wound perspective are these ideas that if I was betrayed growing up, how I can never trust anybody, somebody's going to break my trust. Or if I was abandoned growing up, oh my gosh, I'm always going to be abandoned. Or I'm not good enough, or I'm unworthy, or, all these ideas. And they're so useful to work on reconditioning because those are the exact things that often tend to cause a lot of sabotage and devastation to our lives.
Yeah. So we're talking about these different attachment styles, and then we talk about the other type of attachment style, which we would call secure attachment, right? Now, we've also talked about how these can change over time. I would also imagine that these things also fall on some sort of spectrum, meaning there isn't some line at which I'm suddenly securely attached and a line before at which I'm not securely attached, right? In the same way that we don't think about addiction in the same way anymore, right? We think of it as being on a spectrum.
Absolutely.
And so, because one of the things that I've observed is that I feel like through a lot of work, a lot of the type of work you're describing, I did a lot of this in my early 30s, which was quite some time ago. I'm largely securely attached, except when the stakes get really, really high, at which point I tend to revert back a little bit to my previous types of attachment, meaning I will not get triggered by 90% of what used to trigger me, right? I'll just simply be like, oh, yeah, all right, that happens. I deal with it. But yet when the stakes get high enough or when it gets serious enough, I do find that I'm no longer securely attached. I am back to the way I was before.
So that's really interesting to me. So first of all, I do agree very much that everything's on a continuum, 100%. And that's why we do like a breakdown in attachment styles. Oh, you're, 60% anxious and 40% secure. You've got those anxious tendencies that are dominant, right? Like that, I think there's a really important way to break it down. And then we work on the core wounds and unmet needs and boundary issues associated with working through those anxious tendencies or patterns. One thing that is interesting to me, and I that's what I read into it first when you said it, was there's a sort of dynamic about attachment theory, which is that your attachment style won't show up very strongly until you're actually attached. Now, you went on to differentiate that 90% of the things won't trigger you, but 10% will. And you're always going to be a human being. Becoming securely attached doesn't mean I am now a robot and I don't feel emotion. But, for people who relate to that first statement you said, but not the second, who might be listening, for anybody who goes, yeah, I'm really good, at the beginning of a relationship, but only once I really develop feelings, then I suddenly have these dismissive avoidant tendencies or anxious tendencies. That's generally very directionally pointing to that's probably your overarching attachment style because we don't have that experience until we really have those feelings and feel that degree of vulnerability towards someone.
Yeah. No, I was certainly attached. And again, the therapist I was talking to at the time, because I had a moment of like, what happened? I have done all this work. Like, why am I back here? And he basically posited that theory. He said, look, all that work that you're going to do is going to make you better able to handle more and more and more and more. And then there is a point, though, beyond which, right, things are not fully healed, and that's where you'll go when it gets that extreme.
Absolutely. And I think that it's really important for listeners too, because I know you know this, but to distinguish between like a trigger versus a painful life experience. Like just because you're securely attached, like if somebody passes away in your family or something like that, you're still going to have those deeply unmet needs from grief. You're still going to be affected by that human experience. It doesn't mean you never have like a painful reaction to something. It's just that when we become secure, a lot of those patterns that were maladaptive, those things like amplifying a painful event, like let's say somebody doesn't call you back, and rather than that being a 9 out of 10 abandonment core wound triggered and you're panicked and then you're calling back that person multiple times, you're going to see, okay, that's still uncomfortable because it doesn't meet maybe the needs or expectations I had in that moment. And that can make me feel a negative way, but I don't see myself get extremely triggered, at the 8, 9, 10 out of 10 scale. And I don't see myself feel that I have behaviors in response to that become out of my control. Things like, oh my gosh, I know I shouldn't keep calling them, but I keep doing it anyways. Or I know I shouldn't shut them down and ice them out, but I can't help it. And so that's where you're going to see a lot of that needle move.
Yep. That makes sense. So let's start to talk a little bit about the process of working with these subconscious beliefs or core wounds or attachment styles in a way that we can start to change them. Like, where do we begin here?
Yeah, so I like to cover 5 main topics, and we can go through them in deeper ways, but just so people have an overarching theme, the first one is reconditioning those core wounds, and we can talk about how to do that in just a moment. The second thing is we have to learn to meet our own needs. So when I think of healthy interdependent relationships, I don't think of I get so good at the relationship to myself that I ignore everybody. And I also don't think of I become so good at controlling people's reactions outside of me that I only focus on other people. Healthy interdependent relationships mean I can become a master of my own needs and self-soothing and feeling good in the relationship to myself and spending time alone. And I can become a master at feeling safe to rely on other people and to communicate my needs to others as well. So what you'll actually see as I go through these 5 things, 3 of them are internal, like we have to do the work ourselves, and 2 of them actually become external, like in our interpersonal interactions. So we start with the reprogramming core wounds, then we learn to meet our own needs. It's a big part of how we self-source and self-soothe. Then we do some nervous system regulation. All 3 insecure attachment styles generally are quite dysregulated from a nervous system level. They spend a little more time in sympathetic or fight and flight mode rather than parasympathetic mode. So we do work there. And then we move into learning to communicate more effectively to others and actually receive our needs from others and to do some healthy boundary work. And when we can actually recondition any maladaptive patterns in those 5 major categories, that's where we'll see somebody have the behavioral patterns of somebody who's securely attached. So if you'd like, I'm happy to go into like a tool, for example, for how we can actually recondition core wounds.
Sure. I wanted to ask a question there or follow up on something you said, which was this idea of secure attachment still being attached, right? That word is in it. Because I think for a while there was, and maybe there is still to some degree, but I think if we're not careful, healthy is presented as this, I'm just not affected by what other people do kind of person, right? This island almost, right? And I don't think that's what we are talking about. We are talking about still being attached, about being interdependent on what other people do matters and is important to us and affects us, but also, as you said, not being so far out there, being secure in that attachment.
100%. I mean, I think there's unfortunately, in a lot of ways culturally, this dynamic of going, oh, you're secure when you don't need anybody. And, that's just going back into more dismissive avoidant behavior. That's like, I'm an island, and we're not wired for that. We're wired, actually, in the words of Dr. Gabor Mate, we're wired for both attachment and authenticity. We're wired to have relationships to others, to rely on people, to connect with people, and also to have an individuated sense of self, to know know what it is that we're looking for that's meaningful to us, and to have that authentic sort of independence. But it's ideally the best of both worlds. And just because things are different doesn't mean that they're mutually exclusive. Just because, connecting with others and having a relationship to self are different from each other doesn't mean that it's one or the other. Healthy interdependent relationships actually have both. And to your point, securely attached has the word attached within it.
Yep. Thank you. So yes, I would love to hear some about the first step of reconditioning.
Yeah, so this is a really easy tool that I love to share with people. And there's a whole bunch of ways we can recondition our subconscious mind, but this is one that I always give people to start. So a lot of people out there will be like, oh, affirmations. Affirmations, I think, are not very helpful personally, because your pre-existing programs, like we started this episode talking about, are subconscious. Nobody's consciously waking up and picking those core wounds and saying, today I'm going to tell myself 47 times that I'm going to be abandoned and that I'm not good enough, and I'm going to see how I feel.
Right. I mean, the science on affirmation seems to be some degree they work best on the people who need them the least, meaning they work best for people who already believe that they're good enough, right?
Exactly. And so we have this experience where your conscious mind, I think there's two important things to recognize for people too who don't know this, which is the conscious mind is responsible for 3 to 5% of our daily beliefs, thoughts, emotions, decisions. And then our subconscious and unconscious collectively are 95 to 97%. So it's not your conscious mind running the show, and your conscious mind isn't choosing to think those autopilot thoughts that are sabotaging relationships or destroying different areas of your life at times. And so the first step is we have to find what our big core wound is that's affecting us. Now, there's 18 or so major ones. I'm not going to list all of them, but I'll list some really common ones per attachment style. Anxiously attached individuals, their big ones are around, I'll be abandoned, alone, excluded, disliked, rejected, not good enough, unlovable, unsafe if I lose connection. Dismissive avoidance, their big core wounds tend to be, I'll be trapped, helpless, powerless in the wrong relationship. I'll be weak if I'm vulnerable. I'm incapable of change. I am shameful or defective if I show or share my emotions. And conflict is unsafe, or closeness is unsafe. Fearful avoidance tend to basically share on both sides of the attachment continuum, but they also have unique ones around fearing betrayal, being unworthy, or being bad. So basically, step one, find your core wound and its opposite. Okay, so let's just, for simplicity's sake, say I'm not good enough. So I'm not good enough. Opposite is I am good enough. Now, we can't just affirm that we're good enough, because then the conscious mind speaks language and your subconscious mind does not. So if I say to you, Eric, whatever you do not think of a chocolate chip cookie. You probably have the experience of visualizing a chocolate chip cookie. And it's because your conscious mind hears do not, but your subconscious, the one running the show, sees through emotions and images. So the subconscious speaks emotions and images. Now, we need repetition to fire and wire neural pathways. So step one, not good enough. Its opposite is I am good enough. Step two, we need to leverage repetition, emotion, and imagery. And the way we do that is by finding memories, because all memories are a container of emotions and images. If you share your favorite childhood memory and it's you being on the swing set with your parents pushing you, you would see the images of the swing, and you would, as you recount the memory, smile or laugh, or, your body language would change. So all we need to do is come up with 10 for repetition, memories to support I am good enough. And then we record it somewhere, like into our phone, and listen back for 21 days, because research shows it takes 21 days to really create new neural networks that are hardwired enough where they're going to stick. And it may sound like, oh my gosh, 21 days of work to do those 3 steps, to find the opposite of our core wound, 10 memories to support the new belief, and listen back to it for that 21-day cycle. But the reality is, this will uproot sometimes decades of retelling these same old stories. And I can share firsthand, this was something that was so powerful for me. Through, some of our programs, we have over 25,000 people report an 88.7% improvement in their core wounds on these self-paced programs. So you don't know that people are sticking to them for the full 21 days, but they really, really work. And it's really impactful to just start with that simple tool.
So let's talk about that a little bit more. I am a person who, A, has a very bad memory. I don't remember lots of things. Like I would say the vast majority of my childhood simply isn't even there that I can find. And I don't tend to think in images very much. So when you say to find 10 memories that counteract the core belief, okay, so it's 10 memories that made where I felt enough. Is that if my core wound is I'm not good enough, I would find 10 memories of where I felt like I was enough?
Exactly.
And when you
Exactly.
say record them, what do you mean? What am I saying? What is somebody actually recording?
Excellent question. So you would write out, like, let's say, actually, just for argument's sake, can you share like one memory of a time where you felt enough about something?
You're asking the wrong question. A memory. It could take me 45 minutes to come up with one.
It can be small. They don't have to be these like monumental achievements. Like maybe your podcast reached a certain number of downloads, or maybe you had somebody come up to you and say like, "Hey, you've really impacted my life." Like, is there anything like that for you?
Sure. There's plenty of those sort of things. Yes.
Perfect. So you would write out like a sentence or two that represents that moment. So, Bob came up to me on the sidewalk when I was at, going for a walk at the park. And he said, he listens to my podcast and it's impacted his life. So one or two sentences, you would write them down, and then you would just, take the video on your phone and just not record the video. And you just use the audio only and just read out those sentences from those 10 pieces of memory. And,
Got it.
To be clear, they don't have to be these like for people who don't have, a beautiful, amazing podcast changing everybody's lives like yourself, for somebody who's like, well, I don't know, even little things like, hey, you helped your coworker in the workplace yesterday, or, your boss said, you know what, you're really making an effort and I appreciate that. Just those little tiny things gives us that repetition and emotion that we need.
So I feel like this kind of could run into the same problem, and you could tell me how to get around it, which is if I don't feel like I'm enough, right? I might view those experiences of feeling like enough, and I might then filter them through that core wound so that they don't even feel like, you know what I mean? Like I could see somebody going, well, yeah, like you said, it's easy if you do something where people tell you all the time that you're good, but yeah, I helped my coworker yesterday, but so what? That doesn't really matter. Or I guess I felt like enough when my boss told me that I did a good job, but my boss is kind of an idiot anyway. And like I can see how we would filter these things right back through the core wound.
It's such a great question. So I do see this. I would say I see this in about like 10 to 15% of people.
Us
and it generally
pessimistic
represents
ones.
It usually represents when people, and maybe this was your past, right, is when we have a core wound that's so deep. So, it's like so hard to even like think differently of it or even to challenge it in some capacity because it's so close to our sense of self and who we are for so long. So there's a couple little hacks. So the first thing is we try to get people to just like focus on one pointedness, right? Just focusing on not giving those self-objections, being mindful of your internal dialogue and keeping your mind trained during that 3-minute focus period of listening back to it my boss did say I did this good thing. There was this improvement here. If that's too difficult for people, we then instead hack the system by starting a process called starting general and then getting specific. So we don't go, I am good enough. Here's the piece of evidence. We say, it's possible that I'm improving. And we start for, the first 7 days or so just with that, just evidence that it's possible that I'm improving. Then we move into, I'm seeing myself improve. And then we move into, and so we graduate ourselves when we start to build emotional resonance. Now, the reason this tends to work really well is actually that we have this mechanism in our brain called the reticular activating system. And I'm sure you've heard of this, but for anybody listening, the RAS is basically a filtering system. And the most common example that you'll see it used within is like if somebody's trying to buy a new car. And you may have not noticed that car on the road before, but now that you're focusing on building the new car or buying the new car, oh my gosh, I see the white Jeeps everywhere on the road. So we can actually leverage this when it comes to reconditioning, which is as I start to look for these pieces of evidence, have this routine of like focusing on these things, I'm sort of tuning my dial into this, which also allows us to keep graduating and building momentum across time.
Yeah, I really like that idea. I often think of that with things that sometimes if we can't get ourselves to positive, can we get ourselves to neutral or even undecided, right?
Yeah.
Like I can't quite believe that, but I'm going to be willing to consider that maybe I could be that, right? Because our brains have and this may be more developed in some people than others, like a pretty well-attuned sort of BS system, which is when you're telling yourself something that you don't believe, it doesn't work, which is what we were back to with affirmations. And the other science on affirmations I've seen is that affirmations can be helpful if they are realistic enough that you can believe them to some degree. It's much better to do, like you said, which is like, I might be improving, is a far better affirmation than I'm wonderful if you don't believe you're wonderful, right? But I might be improving is something that most of us can at least get behind. Like, okay, well, I can do that. And so I love that idea of, just dialing things back a little bit till you find that place that does feel like it doesn't make you want to scream out loud, like bullshit, right? Like you find you dial it down to that point. I think that's really good advice.
Exactly. And it's part of why we leverage the proof too, is it makes it more realistic. We're like, well, we have actual evidence, so we're backing it up, or the memories or the evidence. And then if combined, you can sort of dial it
Yep.
back, then it's really hard at that point for it to have a difficult time landing with people.
Yep. I think the other thing that you describe there when you talk about repetition and emotion is important here, which is that oftentimes the first time we do something, it doesn't really do anything. There's no big change, right? And so I talk a lot about, and one of my core philosophies is that little by little, a little becomes a lot, meaning like you do one little thing and it doesn't change anything, but you do that little thing again and again and again and again. And you start to notice the change cumulatively. So I've also found, like you're describing here, that I may do it and I'd be like, well, that didn't do anything. It's like, well, yeah, give it, like you said, give it 21 days before I rule out that it's not working.
Okay, so I love this so much because I just so strongly agree. And so what happens is your subconscious mind wants to maintain its comfort zone, because at the end of the day, we're kind of survival wired, right? So if we have this comfort zone of what's familiar, even if we've been miserable, we're like, well, this is working because I've stayed alive, right? That's like not your conscious mind, but that's your subconscious and unconscious mind. So we work really hard to not change, quite honestly. And this is the example that I give. You know how we talked about those 5 major parts and we started with like core wounds? I actually give this exercise for our needs. So let's say somebody's really anxiously attached and they hate to meet their own needs, right? They want to focus on other people and other people meeting their needs. Usually people, let's say that their needs are for validation or reassurance or things like that, which are generally more anxious leaning needs. I get people to sit down and like, okay, we're going to validate or encourage ourselves by saying like 3 wins that we had today, or we're going to say something positive or compassionate about ourselves, or do something that's like self-reinforcing. And people are like, the first 7 days, people are like, it feels mechanical. It doesn't feel like it's making a huge impact. I feel like it's like, I'd rather just have somebody else say this to me than me do it myself. And I always tell people it's going to feel mechanical for the first 7 days. Yep. Around day 10, we start actually feeling good self-sourcing. We'll start seeing that people are like, yeah, I actually kind of like was proud of myself when I gave myself the validation or reinforcement or whatever need it is, right? And people will start seeing that their ability to self-soothe, which largely depends on our capacity to understand and meet our own needs, doesn't feel good at first. But as you build that momentum through repetition and emotion, when you're hitting day 20, 21, all of a sudden you have these anxiously attached individuals who were terrified of spending time alone or not having a full social calendar, being like, I actually really enjoy my alone time all of a sudden. I'm actually like having a good time with myself. And even things like emotional connection, which tends to be a big need for them. Cool, I'm going to emotionally connect through taking a course and learning about myself, reading a book and introspecting, journaling. At first, people are like, I don't like it. This doesn't feel good. But as you ramp up, sitting around day 10, there's an improvement, day 15. And as we get to 21, people are like, I actually like doing these things. So we self-source through learning how to build that relationship to ourselves again.
So listener, in thinking about that and all the other great wisdom from today's episode, if you were going to isolate just one top insight that you're taking away, what would it be? Remember, little by little, a little becomes a lot. Change happens by us repeatedly taking positive action. And I want to give you a tip on that, and it's to start small. It's really important when we're trying to implement new habits to often start smaller than we think we need to, because what that does is it allows us to get victories. And victories are really important because we become more motivated when we're feeling good about ourselves, and we become less motivated when we're feeling bad about ourselves. So by starting small and making sure that you succeed, you build your motivation for further change down the road. If you'd like a step-by-step guide for how you can easily build new habits that feed your good wolf, go to goodwolf.me/change and join the free masterclass. Yeah. We're near the end of our time here, but this sort of brings us kind of back to where we started when you discussed the wolf parable and you talked about self-compassion, because Kristen Neff, who's the leading researcher on self-compassion, has a term she calls backdraft, meaning that when you start to work on self-compassion, you might actually feel worse for a little bit because it's so uncomfortable, and you're almost remembering the times in which the conditions in which you weren't loved, right? And her point is more or less stick with it, right? Like, even though it doesn't feel good at first, stay with it and that will pass. And I think it's very similar to what you're saying here, which is like, give it a try. 3 minutes a day for 21 days is really not, it's an hour.
Exactly.
If my math is right. Maybe an hour and a half by the time, 2 hours, right? And so, and you see changes occur during that window. So what does the process look like in an ongoing way, right? Because I'm not saying that doing that for 3 minutes a day for 21 days won't make a difference, because I think it can. I also don't think that you reprogram a lifetime of thinking in an hour and a half. So what does this process look like in an ongoing kind of way?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So when it comes to core wounds, I get people to only do 1 or 2 core wounds at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that some people will sit down and be like, I have like 7 core wounds. And so it feels overwhelming, but it makes a huge impact. The analogy I often give is this acronym of BTEA. And this is not the only way it works, but our beliefs lead to thought patterns. So B to T. So if you imagine a core belief is like a tree trunk, all the branches coming off are the core wounds. So if you think I'm not good enough, you think I'm not interesting enough, funny enough, pretty enough, smart enough, fill in the blanks, right? All the thought patterns that will come off enough. How do we feel when we start thinking those thoughts? Will we feel sad or hurt or upset? And then neuroscience has actually proven, a neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio has actually proven that every single decision we make is based on our emotional state. So even people who think that they're very logical, rational thinkers make emotionally based decisions in full and then are just quick to rationalize or justify through logic. And so if we pluck that belief, that core belief out at its root, it will change our thinking, it will change how we feel, and it will change our actions and behaviors, right? You can see if I'm telling the story I'm not good enough or I'm unworthy or whatever it might be, maybe I go home and I drink, or maybe I go home and I binge eat food or watch television for 9 hours to avoid myself. Like, we all have these actions that will follow. So the process I often give to people is like, pick 1 or 2 core wounds that you're sick of, that you're done with, and start there. And people will see their emotional state change. They'll see their thought patterns change. They'll even see their actions or coping mechanisms change over time. And then pick another 1 or 2 that you're ready to get rid of. And it's an ongoing process, but it makes such a big impact. And I also think that, something I promised myself a long time ago is, it's funny, you actually said this at the beginning and it startled me because I was like, I don't think I've said this out loud before. But one of the first things I did on my own journey was, somebody said, you should meditate and you should learn to watch your thoughts and see what you think. And my first time ever meditating, I sat down, and as soon as I sat down, I tried to watch my thoughts. I'm like, okay, watch your thoughts. But my thoughts were already running. And in that moment, I heard myself go, this is stupid. You're going to fail at this like you fail at everything else. What's the point of doing this? You're always going to be this way. And because I was witnessing it in the moment and actually watching it, it was like mind blowing to me. Like, it was so life changing because I was like, oh my gosh, Here's what I'm numbing. I'm numbing this voice in my head all day long. And so, like, I am such a big advocate of reprogramming core wounds because it's changed my internal dialogue. And then it's also changed as a result how I feel and my coping mechanism. So I highly recommend, people doing this. And we see amazing results with tens of thousands of people doing this. But what I would recommend for people is sit down, pick one or two at a time, do it for the 21 days, go back, do a few more, check in, practice being more mindful with your internal dialogue. And as you're doing these things, I always see for people that the momentum builds on itself. We generally see people will go, I'm feeling better, I feel different, I feel more confident. And confidence isn't like the, feeling like you're the best person in the world. It's the absence of all the junk. And we'll see that momentum build and keep doing it and continue on. And when we pair that with like learning to meet our own needs and doing some nervous system work, these are really powerful steps towards healing our internal world and becoming securely attached.
Well, we are out of time. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thais, thank you so much for coming on. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here and really grateful that we got to chat.
If what you just heard was helpful to you, please consider making a monthly donation to support the One You Feed podcast. When you join our membership community with this monthly pledge, you get lots of exclusive members-only benefits. It's our way of saying thank you for your support. Now, we are so grateful for the members of our community. We wouldn't be able to do what we do without their support, and we don't take a single dollar for granted. To learn more, make a donation at any level, and become a member of the One You Feed community, go to oneyoufeed.net/join. The One You Feed podcast would like to sincerely thank our sponsors for supporting the show.